right, we're here with U.S. Representative Sean Casten, just getting an update of what's going on. What's the latest with you, and what have you been working on, Sean?
We've been busy. I'll tell you, I didn't expect to. I remember shortly before we were sworn in, Senator Durbin called me up and said, "Is there anything I can do to help out, to make your transition a little bit easier?" And at the time, we were in the midst of the longest shutdown in government history. And I sort of jokingly said to him, I'm in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be a freshman, and I don't really want to work on PhD level problems. I'd like to start on some easy freshman problem sets. So if you could get the government reopened, that would be pretty awesome. I'll come along. And here we are getting the end of the first term, and what I wouldn't give for the longest government shutdown in history is the most newsworthy event of our first term, right? I think the most urgent piece, personally, getting the climate report out, which we released, which was really 18 months of work. It's the reason that I got into Congress, was the primary reason I got here. We've put out the roadmap of what we need to do in order to make sure that we hand off a sustainable and affordable world to our kids, because cheap energy and clean energy are synonymous. We got that through. We've been, doing a lot of, communications events to get people to understand what's in there, and to try to make sure that that's a part of our agenda for the next Congress and the Biden administration. And then, of course, layered on top of that is we're in this COVID moment where, as hard as we work to do things remotely, it's tough. You can, as you guys know, and I think as anybody who has a job right now knows, you can do things on 40-way conference calls, but you can't do everything you can do when you're all in the office and you can pull someone aside and have a conversation, or have a surprise visitor you didn't expect, who didn't schedule to be on the conference call, and all that goes with that. I think over the next 2 weeks, the absolutely critical thing is going to be that we have to find a way to get the HEROES Act we passed in the House signed into law, because we are about to fall off an economic cliff as the unemployment insurance runs out, as the stimulus programs run out, as states are forced to cut spending, as we think about how to make sure that we can have a safe and secure election when states don't necessarily have the resources to do vote by mail and in-person voting. We've done everything we need legislatively to fix that in the House, all those issues. We need the Senate to take it up, and we really need to do that in a thoughtful way between the two chambers, and not try to get jammed through at the end of the session, which is now 2 weeks away. So that's taking a lot of the priority right now, to make sure that we try to look out for the folks that we are elected to represent.
Wow. So you've been busy, sounds like.
Indeed.
I love that you brought up the clean energy report. I was actually hoping that maybe we could start with that,
Sure.
or at least start with your work around clean energy and climate change, because I think that definitely a growing number, and I think you could safely say the majority of voters would say that they care about, efforts to mitigate climate change. But I think that sometimes that issue gets a bit more muddled when we talk about how to get from point A to point B, and, what kinds of societal, economic, infrastructural changes we will need to make to get there. So I wonder if you could, just for any of our readers who may be less familiar with your background, if you could just kind of briefly summarize your work in the areas of engineering and environmental science and the intersection between the two. I'm specifically interested in your work with the Recycled Energy Development company, and how it relates and how it informs your work now.
Sure. So I am, I guess I'm either, you can either describe me as having a very sort of consistent moral compass, or as a one-trick pony. They're synonyms, I suppose, that I've basically spent my entire life trying to do something about climate change. I got a master's in chemical engineering. My thesis was trying to develop cellulosic biofuels, because I figured that if we could decarbonize the transportation sector, we were going to have to find a way to do that didn't have the food versus fuel trade-off that happens when you're dealing with corn ethanol. So, did 2 years of basic research on that, went from there to working as a as an engineer at Arthur D. Little, a technology consulting firm where we worked on fuel cell and microturbine and battery development and electric vehicles. I remember going to car shows early on and talking with people at Toyota about this car they were going to roll out that was eventually called the Prius. So we're sort of doing all that stuff in the early 90s. And gradually came to realize that there were so many technologies that are totally proven, that have hours of operating experience, that save people money, that reduce CO2 emissions, and are totally underdeployed. And when I say like proven, I mean that 100-year-old technology. And basically came to the conclusion that if we kept focusing on this as a technology problem, all we were really doing was putting new technologies at the back end of a line that wasn't moving. And so how do we figure out how to get that line to move? And so I left consulting to take over a small manufacturing company where we built packaged power plants that recovered waste energy from industrials and turned it into clean electricity. And it was literally 80-year-old technology. All the patents were expired. Every single project we did was 2 to 3 times as efficient as the electric grid. Every single one had a 2 to 3 year payback, and we built some 80 projects in the course of doing that. Then moved to Chicago to start recycled energy development. It was doing a similar thing, but instead of being tied to one technology and instead of being a manufacturer, we went into industrials where we would say, we'll write a check, we'll buy all of your utility assets from you. We'll buy, go into a paper mill, buy all their steam boilers, all their distribution systems. And we will then guarantee you that your price of energy will never rise above what it was before. And we will take a part of the savings we can generate from investing our capital. So we had to generate enough savings quickly enough to not just to recover our capital, but to give them savings and recover what we paid them. And that turned into a $80 million business, a couple hundred employees. Happily would have still been doing that, but I wasn't born with $200 million in my pocket, which was what we ended up deploying. And, so our capital backers wanted to sell, they sold the company. And then Trump happened. And, if my first transition sort of from engineer to entrepreneur was a recognition that this wasn't a technology problem, it was a business problem, the realization I'd had over 16 years as a CEO is that there are far more United States laws that block the development of clean energy than there are thermodynamic or economic laws. And I'd run some trade associations and spent some time trying to change those laws, but felt like I was at a point where I had an opportunity, financially, I had an opportunity to, take a year off, run for office, do something that doesn't have, the kind of compensation structure that you have in the, you're the CEO of a private company, but try to make a difference on the one thing that really matters. And I have greatly enjoyed being in a job now where I think I can say without any, undue, ego inflation, that I'm probably the only one of my colleagues with direct prior experience in the science of climate change, the basic thermodynamics of what we have to do, in the how capital markets respond to pressures in the real market, not the market as you learn about in economic textbooks, but why people actually buy things and why they deploy capital in different sectors, and how state and federal energy policy is completely inseparable from that issue. And it's, I think we have struggled historically to deal with climate change because we've had people who understand climate science but don't understand energy policy or capital markets, or who understand energy policy but don't understand climate science or capital markets, or you can imagine the combinatorics on that. And we have an opportunity to get it right. The window's closing. And the climate report that we have put out basically says this is what we have to do, and we have to start right now. We do not have time to wait. We don't have time to wait until it's politically easy. And I'm tremendously proud of the report we've put out, but it's not lost on me that my grandchildren aren't going to judge me by the quality of the report. The grandchildren are going to judge me by did we make a difference? So we have the roadmap. Now it's time to start driving.
And as far as taking that next step of starting to drive, or really getting the broader public on board with some of these changes that you guys are recommending. What do you think is the biggest hang up? I know that you mentioned a few hang ups as far as, explaining the science around this to your fellow colleagues in Congress, excuse me. But as far as communicating that with the general public, what do you feel like is the biggest misconception around climate change?
The biggest misconception is that this is an allocation of the pain problem when it's actually an allocation of the gain problem. We have for 20 years talked about climate change as a trade-off between a moral obligation to the environment and an economic obligation to our wallets, as if those two are in competition with each other. The reality is that virtually anything you do to lower CO2 emissions leads you to purchase less fuel, which means you have more money in your pocket. And look, my career is proof in the pudding of that, right? We didn't build these 80 plus projects because we convinced companies like DuPont or Kodak or any of the other companies that we dealt with. We didn't convince them to share my morals and ethics. We convinced them that it was good to be profitable. That's a much easier sell, right?
Yeah.
And we also know that at a macro level, because as we've seen this huge surge of renewable energy deployment on the electric grid in the last 15 years, the US electric grid went from emitting 1,300 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, which it was fairly stable at for decades. And it's now down at almost 900. So it's more than a 25% reduction in the emissions associated with every electric megawatt hour we use. And the price of power has fallen by 7%. The reason for that is because if you own a solar panel, a wind turbine, a geothermal plant, a waste energy recovery plant, there is no price of electricity at which you don't turn your power plant on, right? On the other hand, if you own a gas plant, if you own a coal plant, if you own an oil plant, every hour you sit there looking at what the market for electricity is doing and deciding whether or not you can make money based on your asset. And so clean energy has driven down the cost. If you own a Tesla, how much do you care about the price of gasoline? Now the challenge is, how do you get the money to build a solar plant? How do you get the money to buy a Tesla? That's not a cost, that's an investment, right? And we've conflated those two, but the reality is that we have this opportunity to move beyond this, what is the pain, and say, how do you allocate the gain? Because if the price of electricity is collapsing, as it is, thanks to the deployment of clean energy, how do we make sure we still have an incentive to continue to invest in the grid? That's an awesome problem to have, but it's still a problem, right? How do I make sure that my teenage daughters still turn off the lights when they leave the bedroom, right? You still want to have an incentive to conserve energy, even if energy is cheap. And again, those are great problems, but they're problems. And the sooner we can embrace that, we will not only do what I did in the private sector of get people just acting out of their own pure self-interest to deploy clean energy as fast as we can, but we'll also start dealing with the real problems, because those are problems that have to be sorted out. But we've been focusing on imaginary problems for 20 years instead of the real ones.
All right, switching gears a little bit. Healthcare right now, obviously, it's a big deal with the pandemic. What should the federal government be doing? What have we done wrong? What needs to happen in the future?
So look, COVID has made manifest all of the problems in our healthcare system. We absolutely have to get to universal healthcare. How many payers there are that gets there, that's a nuance, but we have to get to universal healthcare, because the system we have where our healthcare system is, if you're old enough, you get Medicare. If you're poor enough, you get Medicaid. And if you're employed and you have an employer who gives you employer-provided healthcare, you're covered there. And if you're a veteran, you get the VA. There's a whole lot of people who don't fit in any of those categories. And with COVID and the economic collapse, there's a lot of people falling out of those categories. And of course, given what the Trump administration has been doing to try to undo Obamacare, there's a whole lot of people who are now have permanent pre-existing conditions for the rest of their life. What we're learning from COVID is that the people who recover still have permanent issues that they have to deal with. We should be we should be defending and expanding the ACA, Obamacare. That should not be political. ACA is not perfect. I don't think Obama would suggest that the ACA was perfect. But we did get about 23 million on health insurance that weren't previously on health insurance, and those people are at risk right now if the Trump lawsuit against the ACA succeeds. So the White House should pull their lawsuit. In the meantime, we've just recently passed a bill in the House that the Senate should be taking up to the patient protections. I always forget the number of this. It's the bill we just passed 2 weeks ago. But it would cap the out-of-pocket expense for people on ACA silver exchanges to 8.5% of their income, so that, you know, as your income is adjusting, you've got coverage. It would give Medicare the ability to negotiate with pharmaceutical manufacturers, which, by the way, the CBO has scored as generating hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth for the economy, because it's your tax dollars that pay for Medicare. So if Medicare is paying too much for pharmaceuticals, we don't go through. Medicaid can negotiate, the VA can negotiate, Blue Cross Blue Shield can negotiate. Because of a rule passed under the George W. Bush administration, Medicare is prohibited from negotiating, and we need to give them that right so that they can negotiate. And, you know, and then there's a whole host of other things that we've been doing through COVID to make sure that, you know, people who need to take time off because they're in quarantine, because they're caring for a loved one, aren't forced to say, if I take time off and leave my job, I'll lose my health care, so I can't afford to take time off. So we need to continue to provide, you know, protections for those folks. Some of that is a job of regulation. Some of that, frankly, is, you know, I think that, you know, we're all in this together. Employers, I think, have a certain obligation there as well, and we'll continue to push for that. But it's really troubling to me that all of that has become partisan. The idea that, you know, we pay more per capita for healthcare in this country than any other country in the world, and we have worse health outcomes than any country that has universal healthcare. You know, if you hate people, if you don't have a moral fiber in your body, but you want to pay less for healthcare, let's do universal healthcare, because every country that does it spends less, and we'd save at least $1 trillion a year if we went to it, just looking at what countries have done. So it's what we should be doing. It's what we should have already done. Unfortunately, right now, the House of Representatives is literally in litigation with the White House to try to make sure that we don't take people's coverage away, that we make sure that people with pre-existing conditions are still covered. And to say that's tragic is to put it mildly.
Yeah, you know, I really enjoyed the conversation that you and I had last week, Sean, about healthcare. I think I actually learned a lot from you. But, you know, I think that we can't talk about access to affordable healthcare in the era of COVID-19 without then having a conversation about the broader economic effects that this pandemic has had on folks across the country, but of course on Illinoisans as well. You know, the last time I looked, I think it was beginning of maybe mid-June, the unemployment rate here in Illinois was hovering around 15%. Obviously, tons of local businesses are suffering. So I wonder, you know, if you could tell us a little bit about some of your thoughts and perhaps some of the strategies that you plan to utilize in you know, how we should be looking at the economic effects of COVID-19 and, you know, how that should be solved going into, you know, potentially a second wave of shutdowns this fall.
So in some ways, there's a direct analog between COVID-19 and climate change, in the sense that it was cheaper to solve this problem yesterday than it is today, and it will never be cheaper to solve it than it is today, going forward into the future, right? Now the problem is that it's hugely expensive to solve the problem today, but it's not getting cheaper. And the problem is that until we get the public health crisis under control, we cannot get the economy back. There is no path to an economy that looks like our economy did a year ago, that still has people nervous about, if I leave the house, I might get sick and die. And that's not about the governors, that's not about the members of Congress, it's not about the president. It's about, what are the scenarios where where you as an individual would be comfortable going to a Cubs game and sitting in the stands next to a total stranger who's yelling "Go Cubs" all the time, and he's got spittle flying out of his mouth, you know, and you're in the cheap bleacher seats, right? You know, I mean, there's a part of me like I want to do that, right? But how uncomfortable does that make you feel right now? And so getting the economy back requires getting the public health crisis under control. We do not at present have therapeutics. We do not at present have a vaccine. We are extremely hopeful that we will have some soon. Once we have them, will we have enough doses to get around? How will we prioritize those doses? Will the drugs be suitable for all people, or will there be some demographics who this drug doesn't work for? We don't, we're anything about that is speculation. So we have to make a decision based on what we have right now. And what we have right now is we can look at countries around the world like New Zealand that hasn't had a case in 2 days, like South Korea that's opening up and their baseball teams are playing again, right? We have seen what countries have done, and what they have consistently done is they've taken a hard lockdown early. They have insisted on mask wearing. They've done significant investments in contact tracing while it's still possible to do that. If you have 1,000 cases, you can talk to every infected person, you can find out who all they talk to, and you can quarantine all those people, and it's relatively manageable. If you're in Arizona right now, 26% of all the people getting tested in Arizona are testing positive. Holy smokes, like contact tracing there is a massive problem. But as I said, if you don't do it, it's going to be more expensive to do it tomorrow, because those 26% are going to go to 27%, 30%, right? You just got to get this under control. And ultimately that's what we have to do now. In the meantime, there's huge pain. Folks are losing their jobs. Small businesses have spent through all of their working capital reserves. They're the most ethical small business owners in the world are still sitting there saying, I'm just out of cash, I got to do layoffs, and then people are losing their health insurance. And I think we have an obligation as the federal government, as the one entity in the whole economy right now who has the capability of deficit spending. We don't want to drive up huge deficits, but we're the only person who can. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that we mitigate that pain until we get the public health crisis under control. It's why we put unemployment insurance out. It's why we need to extend it. It's why we did the Paycheck Protection Program, to make sure that employers can keep people on their payroll with benefits, but cover those costs. And then we subsequently expanded that, and that's now, I think there's about $100 billion left in that fund. We'll see if that's sufficient. It's why I sponsored, along with Adam Schiff and Pramila Jayapal and a number of others, the Paycheck Guarantee Act, which would really model the European model of saying, instead of putting people into unemployment and then paying for food assistance, which is what we do in this country, the European model pays employers the cost of payroll until the unemployment level gets down again. So we make sure that all the sort of benefits that come through, and if you look at what Germany and France have done, they've kept their unemployment level down in the single digit level, even though they got hit early on, worse than we did. We're now worse than they are. But we have the tools, and sort of like I said before, like these things shouldn't be partisan, because we're playing with people's lives. But it is a challenge to get the Senate to do what's right for the American people right now.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think we have time for one more question. I was just wondering this. Obviously, we're talking a lot about COVID-19. It's really difficult not to. It's sort of dominating our life right now, our world right now. And I have to imagine that campaigning in the era of COVID-19 would also be extremely difficult. So I was just wondering if in, the time that we have left, if you could kind of talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are that, come with campaigning in a pandemic, and what your strategy will be to overcome those challenges ahead of the November election.
So I think with all the stresses going on, I almost feel reluctant to complain about it because people are dealing with bigger challenges than we are. That said, I'm looking at myself on Zoom and saying, like, my wife's recent skills in haircutting, I'm trying to figure out if she did a good job or not. This is my third COVID haircut, and she still hasn't figured out how to fade the sides, but I appreciate all her efforts. I think all of us are trying. This is a hugely important election. If you care about the rule of law, if you care about, standing up for the Constitution, all that stuff really matters. It's really critical that folks get out there and vote. On the other hand, I don't think we want to ask anybody to vote or to canvass or to, do all the things that you do in an election if it's going to put their health at risk. And we've been, and that applies as much for the volunteers as it does to the voters, as it does for people who might be on the other end of a door that you're knocking on. And so we've got to rethink everything. We're doing a lot of electronic communications. I really, really like town halls. I think I'd done 30 in-person town halls before COVID. We're now doing a lot of telephone town halls. We're doing a lot of Facebook Live events. It's similar, but it's not the same. You don't have the ability to sort of see people face to face. You don't have the ability to have the small sidebar conversations that you have before an event. But we do our best to be out there and having those communications. And it's not really any different on the campaign side because we're not going to do big rallies, obviously. But we've had hundreds of people do. I think this past Saturday we had 110 people show up to do virtual phone banking on Zoom. And in a strange way, sort of like our conversation at the start, John, some of these things are actually more efficient digitally than they were in person, because if we had all those people in our campaign office, well, we wouldn't have fit 100 in, right? And we also had, as people are doing the phone banking, I was phone banking as well. And all of a sudden somebody says, they take themselves off mute and they pop up and say, hey, I just got a question about what you think about what's going on in China with the Uyghurs. Well, I can immediately answer that question. Everybody can listen in, and then everybody goes back on mute. And so you've got sort of an efficiency of, hearing what happened. I'm hearing what the voters care about on the calls through the 5,000 calls we made that afternoon. People are getting in real time. And so there's some efficiency that goes there. But it does come at the expense of door-to-door knocking. And I am eternally humbled by the, just the volunteer energy and the passion and just the huge number of people who are recognizing in this moment that this democracy is precious, this Constitution's precious, and the sort of wages of citizenship, if you will, is that making sure that we all step up to defend it. And I'm grateful to have so many people who are stepping up to make sure, not because they're telling people to vote for me, but because they're telling people to vote and telling them how to vote safely, how to register by mail, and finding out what the issues are that matter, and then saying, okay, if these are the issues that matter, this is where the candidates stand. Be an informed voter. I think if what we get is everybody votes and everybody's an informed voter, that is awesome.
Well said. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and glad to be here with you this morning.
Thanks so much.